Bro, my name is Hervieu, and I'm the chairman of the Center Students here in Sweden, and I'm going to lead this discussion about the integration politics in Israel. And first, we're going to have a presentation from Waldemar Ingdahl, who has written this report for Timbro, and then Veronica Nordlund and Mr. Isaac Bachman will have some comments on the report. But first, Waldemar, please give us a little brief about your report.
Thank you, Hannes, Mr. Ambassador, Ms. Nordlund, ladies and gentlemen. I am a science journalist and a tech writer, so my first contact with Israel was about IT and technology. After all, there is a story to be told here about so many new startups, new ideas, new technologies coming out of Israel. But I'm also fascinated by integration, partially from my own personal perspective, since my heritage and heritage of my family is from all over the world, from many different creeds and backgrounds coming together here in Sweden. And when I was studying Israel, I was struck by the fact that so many newly arriveds in Israel were starting with entrepreneurship and getting into the tech business. So I decided, as any good writer, to go there, to Israel. And one of the results was the report that we're going to discuss here today, Integrationspolitikens förlovade land. And Israel is a country that has managed several waves of newly arrivals to integrate them under difficult conditions in society and converting them to the labor market. I try to also give a picture of how Israeli society has changed during the course of history because of the continuous process of integrating the large immigration, politically, culturally, and how the welfare system has changed. Because after all, much of the history of Israel has been turbulent, with wars with its neighbors and conflicts inside of its borders, and a discussion on the divisions of citizens and non-citizens in the state of Israel. And that is why I have focused and delineated the report to be about integration issues for Jewish newly come, studying the historical context and commenting current policy. Because there is differences from migration issues, and I wanted to give this concentrated picture because it could be clearer for a Swedish audience. And it is a wave of immigrants during the history of State of Israel that has come from all corners of the world, from different cultures, from different languages, from different degrees of education, and various economic conditions. And I'm going to show you a film that illustrates this, a film by Shmuel Hoffman that is called Many Faces, One Country. See, and just getting where it, there it is. There we go.
From New York. I'm from Los Angeles, California. I'm from Toronto. Germany. Sweden.
Belgium.
Italian. My name is Simon.
I'm from Spain.
From South America.
I come from Paris.
Mexico. South Africa.
And Florida.
My name is Chaim Cohen and known as Indiana Cole.
Come to Israel.
I love Israel. I'm Israel.
This is our home. It's my people.
There we go. So, there we go. So I saw a country built of immigrants of actually 170 different nationalities coming together in Israel and forming a new identity and getting a connection. It is the country in the OECD that has the second largest share of foreign-born in the total population. And it was formed by its Declaration of Independence in 1948, founded as a Jewish homeland. And actually, the reception of the newcomers was preceded the actual forming of the state. Zionist organizations didn't just bring newcomers to Israel, but also managed part of the absorption system and integration, and also parts of the welfare system. And of course, it was a huge wave, and much more than anyone had actually expected. The first newcomers came from parts of Eastern Europe. They were the West Jews. And with independence, there was a new wave of Jews from the Middle East and from North Africa, which of course was a challenge of bringing together different economic and cultural perspectives. And as Israel was under huge pressure from wars with its neighbors, it was also forced to take care of hundreds of thousands of new, often destitute immigrants. It was troubled times, often with brimming refugee camps, and there are distinct differences in how the reception back then formed some of the minorities and how they could, what the results they had over time. After the first difficult time, there was more of stability and new absorption centers, new center for integration, the Merkaz Klita, were instituted, where newly arriveds were to live and to learn Hebrew, because it was a nation formed by a new language that none of the newly arrived previously had spoken. In the early 90s, a new situation arrived. It was a wave of new immigrants. Of course, when discussing Sweden and Israel, there are vast differences. Differences in history, different economy, but there are some similarities. Both are relatively open and economies, dependent on export, and both had similar economic problems during the 70s and the 80s. In fact, Israel shared a history of social democracy, and also from a start in a basic welfare state, also development to a larger welfare state, financed through loans and inflations. In the 80s, this resulted in a banking crisis and an inflation rate peaking at 950%. Also, the number of newcomers fell to an all-time low, which of course for a state founded on immigration is quite an issue. Sweden experienced a similar stagflation and rising government debt. So both countries share a history of budget crisis, of crisis packages, of broad political solutions and reforms. And in Israel, another factor added, namely the fall of the Soviet Union. In a span of a few years, about 1 million Russian Jews and their families came to Israel. The large number, of course, were a huge strain on the present integration system. So, changes had to be done because of the lack of funding, because of the lack of resources, and specialized retraining programs were instituted with also a remuneration program and the so-called absorption basket, which is a series of payments, direct payments to the newcomers. The goal was, from the beginning, to even more get the newcomers out on the labor market because of the dire times. And of course, this has been a long process, but some points are important to notice. I would call this a first step of integration, namely the Ulpan, the language school, where all newcomers learn Hebrew. Because the foundation of integration is to learn a new language. Without a language, integration will not work. You have the absorption basket because it has a positive effect that it puts the individual and not the integration bureaucratic system in focus, because it allows the individual to use this Salklitadi absorption basket how they want and to decide much of their first time, the very important first time in the Israeli society. And there is a first step that could be called the frontline administration, namely of the immigration guides that manage contacts with the authorities and help the newly comes, some even before they arrive to Israel. These immigration guides are often parts of civil society that have a contract with the state, and through this contract get a remuneration of getting the newly arrived through the system, not in base of how long the newly comes are inside the integration system. Israeli civil servants work strictly after the rule book, after the regulation, and there is a contrast here with Sweden's administration that is more centered on achieving goals rather than following the regulation. It leaves a greater span of decision for the individual administrator, but it also has the downside of not getting the newly come in focus for the system and getting also a pressure of getting the newly comes through the system as a new member of society. Of course, if you ask around and if you meet the Israeli system, some will certainly find it harsh, brusque, but there is also the positive side that this is what the newly comers will encounter in Israeli society. It is a preparation of their life for the rest of the time they would stay in Israel. There was a significant difference between the newly arrived from the Soviet Union. They were distinctly more educated than the present Israeli population. But being more educated doesn't necessarily mean more easily integrated, more easily absorbed, because Israel was in economic difficulties, and there simply wasn't work for everyone to do, especially in the many specialized professions that highly educated have. I heard a joke in Israel that back in those days, a symphony orchestra with all their instruments landed at the Ben Gurion airport every day. Everyone was skilled musicians, but what were they to do? Of course, a part of this absorption was done by retraining. There were programs instituted to make engineers into technicians, doctors into nurses, professors in particle physics in order to get new, better science teachers in universities and schools, and musicians as music professors. And of course, it put more on the important first step into the labor market. Another important part was to have a clearing system for translating qualifications from foreign countries, which of course helped many newcomers in rapidly showing Israeli employers what they could actually do in Israeli terms. Entrepreneurship was a necessity. It's said that nations of immigration often become entrepreneurs by necessity, but there needs to be opportunities for entrepreneurs, and something changed in Israel. Some rules became simpler. It's quite easy to found a new company in Israel and get it running through the administration. But there was a lack of capital, so the Israeli government instituted risk capital funds. Some were directed to new companies in general, some were directed towards newcomers. But the goal was not that the government should be involved in these companies, but that government should start these companies, give them a takeoff, and then exit. It was also designed not to try to pick winners among these companies. There were new business centers, new centers of entrepreneurship. I spoke with one of the representatives, like the Mati Center in Jerusalem, that you can read more about in the report. A very interesting case of what can be done in order to spur newcomers to find a role in entrepreneurship and to give them a good start in society. But also labor market. There is actually another similarity with Sweden, namely on what the labor market looked like. The main labor union, the central organization, the Histadrut, had previously a large degree of power through collective bargaining and even owning companies of its own, and a powerful strike weapon. Reforms changed the role of the Histadrut in Israeli society, and opened many parts of the labor market, and also through bargaining on company level, made it possible to have a larger spread of wages in the Israeli economy. It also opened up a market for low productive labor, particularly in the service market, which provided a very important first step into the Israeli economy. Two exceptions. Well, of course, Israeli policy is complicated. Two examples have been discussed quite a lot internationally, and one of them is the group of Ethiopian Jews, about the same time as the Russian newcomers, the newcomers from the Soviet Union. Israel brought in the minority of Ethiopian Jews. It amounted to about 100,000 newcomers from Ethiopia. It was a large group that came from, frankly, the most primitive conditions, from one of the world's poorest nations. They came from subsistence farming at best. Many were unable to read or write, I think about more than 70%. And they were difficult to integrate. They received some special absorption programs that I describe in the report. But of course, it's difficult. In Sweden, we have some similar groups. But coming from those very difficult conditions, there have been some results. Of course, there is also the issue of guest workers and refugees, because in a society that is so divided between the very highly educated and very lowly educated that often Israel has received as newcomers, there is a gap opening up in a certain part of labor skills. You can find guest workers, about, I've seen estimates of 100,000, 200,000 in agricultures and certain service professions. They come from Eastern Europe, parts of Africa, Asia, and there isn't a particular policy about these guest workers. And I have some descriptions of this policy issue in the report and why this development has been. Also, refugees, Israel doesn't have a formalized refugee policy. There have been instances that Israel has received refugees from the former Yugoslav wars, refugees from Africa, and there has been a lot of debate. Some have received citizenship or permanent permission to stay. But I haven't further dwelt on these issues because many of the answers to these problems are perhaps not in the integration policy of Israel, but in other parts of Israel's politics. And some of the solutions, I think, could be used for discussing also these exceptions, but I could write a book about that too. So, where is Israel heading? This diagram shows that it's a nation where you can find a large part that has immigrated themselves, where the father was immigrated and or the grandfather was born in Israel. And from this, you can see that there is an equal part of these. You have a big part of the newly arriveds in Israel. Now, these numbers have lowered. They have lowered quite a lot. Why? Because, well, most have come to Israel. The two biggest countries with a Jewish population is Israel and the United States. I think the third is France. And many of these have good opportunities, a good life. But of course, this could change, and it's also subject to change, not only because of persecutions, but also in a globalized world where people find new opportunities in other countries and could come to Israel. And of course, the integration has changed attitudes and society in Israel. There has been a huge stress, and some would say against all our odds, Israel has persevered, and the waves have been tackled, but also taken care of and used for creating new opportunities in Israeli society and culture and the economy. So, let's have a summary. There are similarities, historic similarities between Sweden and Israel. Changes in Israel's welfare system, and you can see also that a diversity of backgrounds, and the diversity of background is in need of a consistent system. You have a strong appreciation of the importance of language and integration, and the importance of civil society, in this case even preceding that of the state. And you have also the opportunity in Israeli integration to evaluate and convey formal qualifications, and you have an understanding of the importance of entrepreneurship in creating new opportunities for the newly arrived. I mentioned the changes in integration policy. Many travel to Israel, work in Israel from a Jewish heritage. Some stay, some go abroad for a period of years, but come back. And these are issues that both Sweden and Israel are facing, with more mobilized, more globalized populations, where you have to, well, choose two sides, two strategies, you could say. What should appeal to people to come to a particular company? We see some countries that gear to appeal to more high-tech companies if they can provide them with qualified personnel. This will have effects because you will have much more of a recruiting integration policy, which Israel does through business networks, integration networks, like the Gwahim that I mentioned in the report. Or are we to see as the goal of integration policy of companies providing employment to low-skilled unemployed, native to the country, youths and newly arrived? This is a quite difficult question that both Sweden and Israel faces in the future, and my personal opinion is that Israel has moved into the first direction. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ingdahl. When writing this report, what surprised you the most when you studied the integration policy of Israel?
I would say I was at first surprised of meeting both the multicultural side of Israel, but also the absorption process, because you become more of an Israeli when you come to Israel. There are differences in the national identity, but it's quite interesting to see it. And it was also that in Sweden we often have a discussion of, should we maintain the Nordic social democratic welfare state, or is it the alternative anarchy? But this is a social liberal state. It's quite different from ours. It's founded on other principles, on compromises, on historical occurrences, but also on a pragmatic spirit that has worked well for Israel on many occasions. So that was the most surprising part.
Okay, thank you. It's a very interesting report, and all of you should have one piece on your shares to read later on. Now we're going to have a comment from Veronica Nordlund, who is Program Director of Migration and Integration on the think tank Global Utmaning here in Sweden. And we're going to listen to your comments now, so please.
Thank you. And thank you for a very interesting report. Israel is fascinating in this regard, and I think most migration scholars would really agree. And I'm more of a microeconomist myself, so and I always liked behavioral economics. And what enticed me when I started reading is the framing of migration in Israel, and how the words that you use to describe things presumably affect how people behave and outcomes. So here, aliyah as an ascent to a sort of higher state of being is extremely interesting. And also the signal that gets across is that, welcome, this is where you belong, and here's a plane ticket, rather than the sort of rhetoric that we hear in most European countries today is like, well, come if you really, really must, and if you make it here alive, we might consider letting you stay. So even though you don't go into it, I think it would be very interesting to read an analysis of what this sort of framing of migration in Israel has done to integration. And it's sort of a bit like Roland was talking about in the before as well. This is how we identify ourselves in the migrants, and what does that, how that helps integration. Similarly, how the law of return has sort of functioned as a sort of commitment mechanism to integration, I think would be interesting to investigate more. But to get back to your report, still using the terminology of behavioral economics, it's striking how often the word experiment gets used to describe the integration and migration process to Israel. It's been a laboratory study or an experiment of mass migration and mass integration. And the thing with experiments, I think, is that you can study them in great detail and you can learn a lot from them. But you have to remember that they keep a lot of variables controlled. And so that affects how applicable they are to other scenarios. And you said just now that you didn't actually think that the integration policy was the solution for the Ethiopian and the guest workers and the refugees in Israel. You end your report in a quite different manner by saying that simply because the absorption process here is simple and clear, it means it's translatable to other types of migration and to other countries. And I think that was my main critique, is that you don't really substantiate that argument. You don't really convince me that that is the case. And precisely because the migration to Sweden and Israel, as you said, has been extremely different. And I'm not going to argue with that the migration to Israel has been very diverse and heterogeneous, but the success part of the story that you're telling is really, because you're advocating for the reforms that took place in the early 90s. And the success part of that story really just concerns mostly the almost inconceivably large numbers of migrants coming in from the Soviet Union in the 90s. And it's true, and it's extremely impressive how so many people were able to be put to work in a very short time. But as you say yourself, the success has been more limited when it comes to other groups like the Ethiopians. But other than that, it's just the migration process to Israel is also so much more orderly and controlled than the type of migration that we get. The integration process starts in the home country. There's time to plan. Your journey gets sort of arranged for you. You travel with community members and family. You come to Israel. There's a welcoming committee of sorts. How I understood it, and then you can start the integration process from day one, which in refugee migration, what you have is a long period of uncertainty, insecurity, chaos. You spend your life savings on a smuggler. You come to a new country and you have to wait for months and months and months to even know if you get to stay or not. So I think that's a critical point as well. And then you have a whole set of historical background and institutions, a civil society in Israel that's very unique to Israel. I mean, Sweden could never find an equivalent for the Jewish agency or funding for it either. So there are reasons that it's very difficult to compare and say that Israeli integration policy has been so much more successful than the Swedish one. And that said, if you take into account the differences in both the level and also the composition of migration, it's almost comical how we end up at almost exactly the same number when it comes to employment rates for the foreign-born, 64% in Israel and 62% in Sweden. And there's definitely a way of interpreting 64% as a huge success in Israel, while at the same time considering it a massive failure in Sweden. But I think there's a case to be made for being a bit more nuanced than that, and to take that statistic and take the employment rate as your unique measure of integration and use it to motivate and say that Sweden should deregulate its labor market and introduce a low-wage sector. I think that's a little bit excessive. And then there are other things that we can definitely take away from the Israeli case, and I'm extremely impressed particularly by the integration of the high-skilled migrants and the vast array of measures that you list that have been enacted in order to ensure that you minimize the human capital loss involved in this process. I'm sure there's been brain waste in Israel as well. There's bound to have been, but it is recognized as having sort of catalyzed a high-tech boom in Israel in a way that's been very impressive. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much. A big applause for that comment. Mr. Ingdahl, would you like to comment Ms. Nordlund's view on your report?
I think there are, of course, differences, but it shouldn't have been matched because Israel has such a difficult start. It should have been a walkover victory for Sweden. What happened? Why didn't the results get so much more worse in Israel? Why can you do these? Why can you make this comparison? And I think there is something to learn from this. But of course, there are huge differences in history and also on how and from where these immigrants have come and how they have arrived to Israel. But still, many of these came like refugees come to Sweden now, walking through the deserts or being airlifted or coming with barely nothing more than the clothes that they had on their backs. And there are differences in how they were absorbed into Israeli society. And I tried to convey some of the research on that they did meet different conditions and what happened to them and what is happening to these older groups, these older waves that have arrived, back then, and what is happening now.
Ms. Nordlund would like to comment that as well. What would you say is the biggest difference between the migration in Israel and Sweden?
The composition of migration, or in terms of the policy that
Well,
was
both.
enacted? Well, I would argue that because what you are really presenting, that's what's happened since the 90s. So then, of course, if you take the whole history of it, that's another story, and it's very interesting as well. So the immigration, as of lately, has been more of a homogeneous immigration into a very heterogeneous country, whereas with Sweden, we've had the opposite. We've had a very sort of diverse type of immigration to a country that's just consisted of ethnic Swedes for the longest time. And there's so many differences and comparisons that you can make from there. And what I thought was striking when you then described the direct absorption process were not the differences between Israel and Sweden, but actually the similarities. You would almost suspect that Swedish authorities have glanced a little bit at Israel because
Actually, we had a big reform in 2010 with some sort of immigration guide called etableringslotsar in Sweden. But there are quite some differences and still something to see in the Israeli system that I think would make some interesting knowledge for reform in Sweden too.
Right. Well, but we are moving towards a more rule-based and centralized, returning rather, towards a more rule-based and centralized integration program, and we're also having a more clear labor market focus now. And the reform has yet to prove itself. At the moment, it's looking so-so, but I mean, we might get there, and I also think it's very important that we're extending it to another set, more relatives coming later in the process as well. So I'm not going to argue with that. I think it might do us some good, but just because you put a label on something calling it job-oriented doesn't make it so.
So thank you very much, Ms. Nordlund, and we're going to have now a short comment from Mr. Isaac Bachman as well, the ambassador of Israel here in Sweden. Welcome up.
Thank you. First of all, thank you here in Timbro for having us with such a fascinating subject to dive into. As a diplomat, I find myself in a difficult situation to compare Israeli policies with Swedish ones, so I won't do that. But I'll be very glad there's the story with a rabbi that has this husband and wife coming to him, everybody with his allegations against the other, and he tells one, "You're right," and the other is, "You're right." And then his helper comes and tells him, "How come both are right?" So the rabbi tells him, "You're right also." So both are right. Okay.
It's not a competition.
So I think that some of the criticism or the points of analysis brought here were right, and I don't have too much to add into the description, mainly description, with some conclusions, of course, of the Israeli system. What I'd like to bring in is some additional points as to how we treat. Not so much officially, because this has been described already. In our case, immigration is not a necessity. The reproduction rate in Israel, the number of births per woman in Israel is 2.96. This brings a very natural growth in population with no need for additional fresh bread. But we have a pillar policy in the policies taken along the 65 years of Israel existence, which is to have a reservoir of immigrants, which is the Jewish people. Israel has been established as a Jewish state, as a refuge place, a shelter to the Jewish people, and by the Jewish people. Now, it is not discriminating anybody else, and we have, just to discard any misunderstanding here, we have a large 1.6 million minority of Israeli Arabs. They are making part of the Israeli system, politics, parliament, everything. So, but we, as the shelter for the Jewish people, a shelter which is very needed, as history told us and showed us, we actually created this reservoir, and we have no control over the number of people that would knock at our doors at a given moment. And the decade that has been described here, the 90s to 2000, is an excellent example for that. We had 1 million of newcomers coming from the ex-Soviet Union, and at the same time, almost parallelly, we had about 100,000 coming from Ethiopia. Nothing to do with one another. The only common denominator, if at all, is that when they go to the synagogue, they pray the same prayers, more or less. I'm saying more or less because there are some differences in style. So we don't control the numbers, and we don't control so-called the quality, the properties of the individuals that would come. Are they, educated or not? So we take the risk here. Israel is a kind of policy insurance for the Jewish people. So some of them come, some of them don't. Some of them come when it's very necessary, because in their countries they, go under times which are not so comfortable. And some of them would come because they want simply to live with their brothers from the Jewish faith and to share this life. So those are first two observations. We are an ongoing immigration absorption type of society from day one. When Israel was established in 1948, we started with this policy, and it's an ongoing process with ups and downs. I'm a son to both parents that were born. In this case, it's a light case. Both were born in the same town in Romania, survivors of the Holocaust. But my wife, on the other hand, is a daughter to a father born in Germany. Luckily enough, they made Aliyah. They came to Israel a little before Hitler took over. They sensed things coming up, and they made Aliyah. They came to Israel, and her mother is born in Israel, but her parents came shortly before she was born from Libya. It's a good example how things are. In my generation, I think the vast majority of citizens of Israel at my age are sons, daughters to immigrants. And this is an ongoing process. We have yearly, as we speak, around 20,000 new citizens that are not born in Israel. This is a kind of a reserve that is ongoing, coming to Israel yearly. Some of the things that make this process maybe a little easier on top of all the policies. I'm beyond the policies, with no analysis to policies. When I look at the Israeli character, I think that we are very extrovert, very open. You know, the negative aspect of what I've just positively described is the American known chutzpah. So it works both ways. When it comes to Aliyah, it's very easy to come to a society where everybody speaks to everybody, and you can ask anyone, at any given moment. In Israel, you go in the bus and you speak to your wife, telling her, well, I went to this shop and I bought something. It was a scandal. You know how much they charged me? And someone in front of you, sitting in the front seat, would tell you, oh my God, but I went to this shop. Go buy there. Okay? So, and this is how it works. This is the daily life. It's not a joke. So maybe the fact that we are a very open society, very multicultural, and you know, everybody speaks to everybody. In Israel, one person, when he thinks, it's already a dialogue. Okay? When two Jews are, you know, having a conversation, we are so opinionated that it is a fact that two Jews would have three opinions. So this is what we are, and this comes as an expression in the process of accepting others, coming in. We are sons and daughters of immigrants, and it's very obvious for us. It wasn't so obvious at the beginning, okay? But it is very obvious for us to see somebody that is coming from other society with no language and no knowledge of the Israeli type of behavior. We have also an army service, which has its political and military negative aspects. We won't touch it. Nobody is so happy to go to serve the country or the nation for 3 years in the army. But it's a melting pot. This is the place where we become Israeli. It's an instant thing. Once you went to this army service, you come out, you are, you know, you are approved and sealed Israeli. That's it. Okay? And this is a natural thing that happens. Well, it's a necessity, but the necessity brings some revenue in this sense. Okay? We have a society which is, in this sense, unlike Swedish, without entering politics, very competitive. We educate our kids to be competitive, not to go on the mainstream, no consensus. Competitive. You should, you know, if you come back from school, you got only 80, you ask, what was the grade that your friend got? Oh, I got 85, how come? It's not exactly like that, but you know, just to illustrate how it works, okay? So it's a very competitive society, it's a very individualistic society, and it's a society that would deal easily with differences, with changes. I mean, look at our political situation. It actually educates us to lead with changes. This is what happens in the most constant thing in Israel is the change. It's something that happens frequently. It is a result of things that are imposed on us externally. Some of it is also internal, but the dealing with changes is very common in Israel. With individuals that are different is very common. Different in any sense, positive, negative, neutral, whatever. So when we see somebody else coming from anywhere, speaking a different language, not knowing what we do, it's very common to embrace him and tell him, come on, let's show you how it works and be part of us. Additional things, we have very many non-governmental organizations that are dealing with many things, including immigrants. You know, each and every group of immigrants from any given country would have an organization of those that immigrated from Argentina, for instance. So they will be very forthcoming for the newcomers that would come from Argentina. They will embrace them, and they would give them some consultancy in their own language. At the very beginning, it's essential, and would be very helpful in telling, no, go to him, I'll call my friend and I'll help you with this. And you know, it's a kind of tribal, mini tribal thing of embracing the newcomers in their own language, in their own culture, which makes it also a little easier. I think that this is basically what I wanted to point out, and I'll be open for questions and observations.
Yes, thank you so much. One thing that I think is very interesting, and Ms. Nordlund mentioned it as well, is that Israel is very good at, you know, getting people who is very high educated and high skilled to get easily into the society. And in the report, Waldemar shows out that if you are a new arrival, you get some tax reductions and so on. But if you are a scientist or an entrepreneur, you get even more tax benefits. How important is it for Israel to get these very high skilled people to come to Israel?
Well, it's very important, of course. As we say, we take the risk. It's an insurance that you never know how much it would cost you. Sometimes you get easy customers coming with education, and you only have to give them retraining. And sometimes you get people like from Ethiopia, 100,000 people, just for you to understand. We are talking about people that we had to teach them, and I've witnessed such a process. What money is. Money. You forgot about money, but there is money. Today it's plastic money. So they did not know what bills are and coins, okay, let alone the plastic money. So these are procedures when you go to the supermarket. What is this? And how do you pay? The starting point is very low, so we had to kind of having different systems of absorption to different types of newly coming people from different countries. I won't tell you that it's an easy process. I won't tell you that it's 100% successful. But I think that by now, those that came in the 90s from ex-Soviet Union, 70% of them own their own apartment, for instance. I think that in a society where the element of newcomers is so, and immigrants is so intensive, at any given moment, we have reached, you know, this UN index of happiness that they publish. We are on the 11th place in this list. So we have some indications that it works somehow. People come and they feel the sense of belonging. It's a quick thing that happens in Israel. Somehow it's in the air. It's in the way we behave, and maybe this is the element that brings success into the process of integration.
Mr. Ingdahl, do you have any comments on Mr. Bachman's comments on your report?
Well, we are at Timbro, the free market think tank, and of course that there are, from a free market perspective, some things to say about Israel, because it's, after all, a high-tax society with about, well, from a Swedish perspective, income taxes are low, but it's about 50%, am I right? And you have a relatively high tax for corporations, which was in fact raised recently from 25 to 26%, which of course is, I think it's a difficult proposition for Israel because your direct competitors have lowered theirs. But of course, those are some part heritage of the previous Israeli model, which was from a social democratic model, and of the political climate in Israel. Still, I think there are some interesting things to see from the Israeli model of a welfare state, particularly because immigration and integration changes us. There isn't a going back to the Israel or Sweden in the 70s, 80s. We have to find new solutions, and our experiences are, of course, different, but something we can see from Israel, especially from its difficult start and how Israel achieved results from that.
Thank you so much. We welcome up Ms. Nordlund again, and we have a discussion, all the three of us. After listening to Mr. Bachman, do you have any comments on his view on the Israeli politics?
Well, I think, as you say, the attitude and the way you greet people, and of course, it's critical to the success of integration. And I have every respect for how difficult it must be to this country where people are a bit introvert, and we are individualistic as well, but in a completely different way from what you are. And you see by now everyone's seen that world values graph where Sweden sort of places itself right up in the corner, the most secular country in the world and the least, or the most highest on self-expression values. So yeah, no, I think that's one part of the story, is how we sort of, as a society, have to adapt, and integration, by definition, is a two-way process, and that I think maybe applies to the welfare state as well. That the welfare state has to make some concessions to immigration, but definitely nothing radical, I would say. It's just a mentality change. Not sure how to accomplish that, but.
If she agrees with me,
Then we're all
why
happy.
should I bother?
But when reading this report, you find that it's, and Mr. Ingdahl showed us before, it's many different kind of ways to in Israeli immigration policy. Wouldn't it just be, you have tax benefits on your car, when you arrive you get a free cell phone and so on and so on. Wouldn't it just be easier to lower the taxes over the line and get it easier? I think it seems like to be a very bureaucratic system and takes a lot of effort to administrate it.
It is bureaucratic, but the idea is to make it easier on those that especially need it. And when you are a newcomer, you have special needs, at least at the first stage. And in our case, the first stage is quite short. It's a 1 year of enjoying those benefits, and then you go out and you're on your own. I mean, in the worst of cases, you will enjoy, as other Israelis, the national insurance system, which would give you the very basic income that would make sure that you don't starve, and you run your very basic needs, and it is as low as to make sure that you'll have the incentive to go out there and make your efforts. But on the other hand, I should emphasize that we have governmental defined minimum salary, which is reasonable. So you can't be paid less than that, okay? If you work and you get that, you'll be floating, okay? And shortly, if you are capable, if you have the possibilities, you can go up the road.
Mr. Ingdahl, have you seen, when you're studying in Israel, have you found it a very bureaucratic and a little bit too big system to administrate? Would you think, we always talk about Sweden, that we have so many bureaucratic rules and stuff, but when you watch Israel, it seems like they have even more.
It's a very rule-bound system. I would say its positive effect is tough love versus the people approaching it. There is generally a lot of tough love in it. Get your act together because you actually got here. So you have quite a lot to put up for you to have actually reached Israel. But there is also quite many negative aspects of it too, because it's bureaucratic, it's inefficient, and Ambassador Bachman said that it's important to lessen it for the newly comers. And of course, we could have a seminar of its own on Israeli public sector and how you could make it more efficient and more valuable for the Israeli taxpayers, but it's not the scope of this report or of this seminar. And I think that what we can have as a take-home point is that perhaps rule-bound systems could be used for very diverse immigration and for very diverse programs. Because why did the Swedish system work in this more goal-oriented way? Because you basically had the same tasks to administer every time, or rather similar. Now you have to face up with many different cases, often finding it difficult to reach over the hurdles to come into Swedish society. In fact, Israel has a law mandated minimum wage of, what is it, 4,000 new Israeli shekel, which is of course a very low level of standard of living. I think the business paper Globus put reasonable lifestyle in Israel at about 6,000 shekel. And of course, it's a very tough lifestyle that comes from this minimum wage. But I think the problem with the minimum wage is that there is no law-mandated minimum wage in Sweden, but through collective bargaining, you have quite high wages, which of course help the already established, because it's difficult for youths, low-skilled labor, and of course newcomers to enter the labor market. And so far we've been in Sweden focusing on discussing cultural issues, that people don't want to get integrated, or they cannot get integrated, or that Swedes are having negative attitudes towards immigrants without seeing the real economic structural reasons.
Ms. Nordlund, do you agree that we have an economical structural problem in Sweden that Mr. Ingdahl just described?
We have objectively high minimum wages, and we do have high thresholds to the labor market, and there's two stories to that, and that one is discrimination, which you don't want to talk about, and the other is wages and job security, which the left would not want to compromise on either. And I think there's definitely a case to be made for that wages in Sweden are too high, and I don't think the way to make that case is by looking at Israel, to be honest, because to me it's not that clear who the low-wage sector has benefited. You say yourself, I mean, the high-skilled migrants are too high-skilled for it, and the low-skilled migrants are too low-skilled for it, which leaves you with the guest workers who are faring pretty badly and who have very limited rights. And I thought it was interesting looking at the curve of immigration to Israel, is that how the Soviet immigration started at the same time as you started taking in all the guest workers. The importation of guest workers took off around the same time. And there was an effort, from my understanding, is that the Israeli government tried to sort of channel the Soviet migrants to a construction sector that had been left vacated, largely because of the Gulf War and more Palestinians being prevented from going to work. And then the guest worker scheme has sort of continued to increase through the 90s. So if there is a demand for a low-wage sector, that's one thing. But to artificially create a demand for it in Sweden, I just don't see how that could be done. And I'm not sure we want it to be done, because I think far from saying that a high unemployment rate among the foreign-born is an inevitable result. We should try to fight it, and there are measures of doing that. But we also need to look at the bigger picture. What kind of jobs do we want in the future? What type of society do we want?
Ms. Bachman, any comments on the Swedish model discussion here?
Yeah, the guest workers, the term guest workers, when it comes to Israel, I'm not sure that I get the notion what it means, but I guess it is those that are coming from the African countries. Are those the guest workers?
Yes, from Eastern Europe.
Well, but then we have to give it a different description, because as you well mentioned, aliyah versus immigration makes a difference, because guest is somebody that you open the door to and comes into your living room and you serve them with something. Those workers are infiltrators. They came from African countries. You won't believe it, but in the Middle East, Israel is considered to be a paradise. And from African countries, people would come to work in Israel because what they would earn in Israel and send back home would be a fortune. So those people are coming from African countries, crossing Egypt, including, it's a big industry. There are many Egyptians that turned it into an industry to bring in Africans crossing the Sinai Desert and bring them to Israel. So this is not guesswork. It's a little misleading, the terminology, because what it is, you know, labor force that is coming to work in Israel in order to send money back home and have better standard of life. They don't look for Israeli citizenship. They come to work. They want to work for a while, few years, and go back home. This is a problem. It is a problem. It stopped the influx of those infiltrated stopped because we constructed a fence on the Egyptian border that makes it very complicated for them to cross. And it stops. We are still with like 70,000 of them, and we have to find a solution to that. But this is not, it has nothing to do with immigration. This is something else that I think, you know, Europe suffers from the same phenomenon more or less, and we are looking and struggling to find a solution. It's not so easy. And they don't make it easier on us when the way they behave and the way they you know, mislead us with where they come from and what the reason for their arrival is. But those are not looking, people that are not looking for refuge. Just to clarify this.
Yeah, is it because we earlier today before lunch we had a discussion about immigration policy in America, and Roland Perry Martinsson wrote a report about how people are viewing illegal immigrants and so on in America, and he showed that in America it's a very positive view to illegal immigrants to become American citizens and so on. And he also showed that it's a little bit different in how to face the problems in comparing to illegal immigrants and so on.
Well, but in our case, those guests, infiltrators, name it as you wish, are not coming with the purpose of becoming Israelis. Okay, they come to have a better life. In the US, it's different. You know, you have now lately, about a month or 2 months ago, there were like 7, I think, million of Hispanos that were given, granted the permit to stay after they, you know, they were there for so many years illegally. So I don't compare those two systems. It's totally different. In the States, they came in to stay. They came in to have a future with their, sometimes with their kids, with their whole family. And they are there for a few years already. So it was a question of time till the Americans would find a way to solve this problem and make sure that from here on, but not backwards, they would block the possibilities for others to come in.
Okay, we're going to have a little bit questions from the audience as well. And Victor is having a microphone and walking around, and we have a gentleman in the back. And please speak close to the microphone and also tell your name and question into the microphone.
Mr. Ambassador, my name is Nils Ire, if it helps you. My question is speaking about the Ethiopians, the Falashas, I think you call them. What has happened to them today, shortly? Please tell us.
First of all, just to clarify, Falash is the strangers. When they were in Ethiopia, they were called Falash, strangers. When they came to Israel, they became Ethiopians or Jews or whatever it is. They don't like the definition Falash, so we don't use it. Well, as we mentioned, this is a wave of immigration that came with a starting point which is very difficult to deal with. Of course, that it is a slower process to have them integrated. But I can tell you that after 20 years, you have lawyers, pilots, you know, the second generation is very well established in Israel. The starting point is not easy. I assume that the skin color makes also, in certain cases, create some difficulties. But in most cases, the mainstream in Israel won't look at it as something which will be a kind of an obstacle or unpleasant element to deal with. So I think that they are doing much better. I think that the starting point of the old generation that came in was disastrous. I mean, there was no way for them to integrate. They did not even expect to do so. Okay? So I think that given the circumstances, it was difficult, but at the end of the day, quite successful. Still some difficulties. You know, the crime rate among the Ethiopians is higher for obvious reasons. No guidance at home, no possibilities to help them with schooling and so on and so forth. But it's gradually becoming much better.
We have a questioner here as well.
Hello, my name is Victoria Nilsson. My question is for Waldemar and then also for the ambassador, because you talked about this earlier. And it's about civil society organization and welcoming of newcomers in Israel. Because a few years ago here in Sweden, we had a book from the think tank Forest, where they really focused on how civil society is used in Canada to welcome newcomers and how this is part of their success story. In Sweden, in most cases, you just meet a government official and that is the end of it. So regarding the civil society organizations in Israel, do they receive any state grants? Do the states sort of cooperate with them in any formalized way? And so on. Thank you.
Well, as said, they actually preceded the government. And the main one is the Jewish Agency for Israel, which is a branch of the World Zionist Organization that was founded in, 1920? And they do the integration process through these immigration guides. And they have contracts with the Ministry of Absorption, the government's Ministry of Absorption, and certain protocols that they should follow. And of course, there are discussions of how well they do their job, as with any government contract. But generally, they seem to do a good job. And they have a degree of competition too, because I give examples of other organizations, well, competing for the government contracts. And the film was from one of those organizations.
Mr. Ambassador?
Well, I think that we have organizations that would work on the national level, and on top of it we have municipal ones. So when the newcomer would arrive to a certain town or a city, there would be a local guy or somebody that would help him with, finding his way in his very common, daily, continuous environment. I think this is an helpful element. I can tell you that as a diplomat, I thought about the similarities of immigrants and diplomats. There are many. I think that when you travel from one place to the other, just for you, in my personal case, this is the 6th destination I work in, namely not for a month or two, for years. I came here for 4 years and I did this previously, and this is the 6th time I do it. So each time you come to a place, to find your way, to know where, to buy the bread and the very little things that you do, and it's very obvious for everyone here, are a project. So in this project, we try to help them and to make them feel as quick as possible at home. I think that those that come and they are religious Jews, when they go to the synagogue, it's another element which helps them a lot, because the synagogue is it's a very community-based type of activity. There are synagogues in every neighborhood. So you will go to the synagogue walking like 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 7 minutes, the most. So you'll meet people there that are becoming your friends. So this creates another circle of possibilities and people to call to and to ask and know how to go about.
Ms. Nordlund, how important do you think it is with civil society to be a part of the immigration process?
Well, coming from the civil society, I think it's very important, and we'd like more support to be able to do more. I think it's very important, and again, it's something that Sweden is looking at, and I think we're moving sort of in that direction, incorporating more people with the Lutzer, for instance. So most third sector, the volunteer sector, as well as private companies in the process. I'm very positive to that. But
well,
again, there's no real equivalent to what you have in Israel, and I'm not sure we're going to find that and funding is going to be an issue.
One last question here.
Yes. Thank you,
You need to speak a little bit closer to.
Yes. Yes. Okay. Thank you for your report, your speech. I was just wondering one thing about the table you showed earlier with the, 1.2 million coming from the former Soviet Union, etc. And it says it was from 1948, but that must have been wrong, because I mean there were about 600,000 Jews coming from Arab countries, especially from 1948 to 1956, 1960, and they are not on that that table, and you didn't mention them either. But it may be so that your report was only from the 90s rather than the whole history. I'm not going to make things difficult for you, but have you any views on how the integration has worked for the Jews from Arab countries now? I mean, when you see them now.
Madam, you'll find the source of this table on page 9, and you can find it from a link, and you can see for yourself at the original source. And for the Mizrahi, for the East Jews and the Sephardi, you can find some writings about them in the report of the degree of alphabetization and the difficulties, because they did change also Israeli society, and they have some discussions of their political effects. Just to mention one, their effect on forming the now government party of Likud, and also how they have gotten more absorbed, but you can still see some differences. And I think why? Well, because they came to a much poorer state, but also under much more dire, more difficult conditions. They came with nothing across the desert or being flown in, and they were absorbed in refugee centers. If you compare them with the later absorption centers or the individualized Salklita absorption basket, you still see the differences. So we can learn, or at least see, which integration policies that worked really less well and which worked even better.
Okay. Thank you. Because you mentioned something about preparations in the homelands and planned reception, and of course that was not the case when Israel was struggling just to survive. And there were so many coming in those early 50s, let's say. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for all your questions, and very special thank you to Waldemar Ingdahl, Veronica Nordlund, and Mr. Isaac Bachman, who has been here at Timbro for this discussion. So, thank you so much. Bring this report home and keep on doing this discussion.
Thank you.
Come and visit me.
Certainly.